So at the time of uploading this video, it will be the 15th of May. This day marks the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, when some 700,000 Palestinians were expelled and displaced following the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And it was this event that kickstarted the cycle of oppression towards Palestinians we see till this day, with their ownership of Palestine shrinking and assault by Israel continuing even at the time of recording. It is a sad and bitter reality that you and I must recognize so that some sort of change can happen. However, the State of Israel is also defended by a plethora of people and organizations who have consistently justified the country's actions while also demonizing the Palestinian people in the process. And this is where we get to a conservative YouTube channel by the name of PragerU, who for nearly a decade has whitewashed the conflict in a variety of ways, from using Palestinians to even apartheid victims to guilt trip the audience and to mislead them on Israel's sinister history. But this video will focus on one of PragerU's older and most popular videos in their entire channel, the so-called Middle East problem as they put it, where PragerU shifts the blame on Palestinians and Muslims while Israel is supposedly an innocent state that only wants peace. So this video will not only expose how dumb these claims are, but also debunk many of the talking points that Zionism promotes in general. So without further ado, let's get started.
When I did my graduate studies at the Middle East Institute at Columbia University's School of International Affairs, I took many courses on the question of the Middle East conflict. Semester after semester, we studied the Middle East conflict as if it was the most complex conflict in the world, when in fact, it is probably the easiest conflict in the world to explain. It may be the hardest to solve, but it is the easiest to explain.
So PragerU starts off with a decent claim, because I do agree that people tend to overcomplicate the conflicts in the Middle East, mainly because of a lack of understanding. But PragerU only mentioned this to then say this.
In a nutshell, it's this. One side wants the other side dead.
That is their argument in a nutshell. So over 7 decades of abusive oppression can be summed up as Israel good and Palestinians bad. Well, before we continue, I want to address two things crucial to understanding this video so we can understand why PragerU's claims like that are absurd. So firstly, how do people justify the state of Israel, aka Zionism? And secondly, why are most Palestinians and Muslims opposed to Israel? So let's start with the first question. To summarize, Zionism is basically the ideology that strives for the existence of a Jewish state. This is basically the movement that PragerU, alongside many other people in the West, either subscribe to or are complicit, but they're not really sure about it. But anyway, the movement came at a time when European Jews faced centuries of oppression, massacres, and segregation by their Christian overlords. However, with the French Revolution in the 1800s, the beliefs in liberalism, secularism, and nationalism were promoted all across Europe, and it was these values that had huge consequences to how societies and the countries understood themselves. It was the first time where unity through religion was casted aside for unity in race, language, and culture. For Jews in Europe especially, a group of people who faced anti-Semitism and segregation for centuries became very attracted to the idea of a Jewish state, a potential safe haven for the Jewish people as they thought and put it. This is not only exclusive to Jews, by the way. For the next 2 centuries, every ethnic group you can think of were attracted to nationalism and self-determination. And the point of even mentioning Zionism here is that it entirely revamped the Jewish identity from a religious one to a more secular and nationalist one. You had the Hebrew language being revived, aspects of Judaism reformed to copy more liberal ideas, and a historical narrative made that justified Jewish nationhood. Now, I hope that you don't think I'm defending Israel here, or Zionism for that matter. I'm not. Because the glossy narrative that many Zionists believe in starts to crumble when you take a step back from the romanticized perspective. And this is where we get to the second question. Why are Muslims obviously pissed off about Israel? With the context of Zionism covered, many Jews during the 1800s began to settle in Palestine, which was at the time under the Ottoman Empire. But when World War I kicked off decades later and the Ottomans collapsed, Great Britain, in their 1917 Balfour Declaration, promised Jews their own state. Well, kinda, since the British only cared about expanding the empire at the time and were willing to use Jews as an advantage. But anyway, this was obviously a problem with the vast majority of people living in Palestine at the time. In particular, the Muslims and Christians that made up 90% of the population post-World War I. These locals were opposed to the partition plan of Palestine because obviously their lands would go to a Jewish minority that predominantly came from Europe, no matter the borders and plans offered towards the Palestinians. Because Jews were a minority and were spread all across Palestine, Whatever land they got in a future Jewish state would have always been at the expense of the Palestinians. And this context is crucial to understand why Palestinians were and are still rightfully pissed off about Israel even existing, something that PragerU is going to completely ignore and then also demonize the Palestinians for in this video.
Israel wants to exist as a Jewish state and to live in peace. Israel also recognizes the right of Palestinians to have their own state and to live in peace.
So when PragerU says that Israel wants to, quote, exist in peace, it's basically a code word for don't criticize the Israeli regime. Because let's say if the international community actually did their job and highlighted the decades of abuse towards the Palestinian people, it is going to raise a lot of questions as to why the state of Israel even existed in the first place. This is because if you follow the breadcrumbs, the source of the Palestinian struggle comes from Israel's independence in 1948, and it was their independence, their creation, that led to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians either displaced or expelled from their homes. And this is what kickstarted the resentments of Muslims towards the state of Israel, because Muslims in general, and this is something you'll see throughout history, are very attached to all aspects of the Muslim community across the world. So unlike other religious communities, when Muslims see their fellow brothers and sisters in Palestine being oppressed, getting kicked out of their homes, and having their statehood being squashed, of course, it's going to rile up a lot of hatred towards Israel, no matter any compromises that Israel may offer towards the Palestinians. And also, PragerU claiming that Israel wants to recognize Palestine as a state is blatantly untrue. Even in one of the older videos, they not only admit that the West Bank is currently occupied by Israel, something that holds back the Muslims in Palestine to have their own state, but apparently this is a good thing because, quote,
under international law, until a meaningful peace is achieved and all terrorism against it ceases, Israel has every right to retain military control over this area. Since no peace treaty has been reached and the terrorism continues with new attacks threatened almost daily, Israel is under no legal obligation to leave.
So let me ask you something. How is a sovereign country supposed to function when you have a foreign military power occupying them? Because of the 1993 Oslo Accords that supposedly gave peace to the Middle East, Israel currently controls over 60% of the lands that's supposed to belong to a future Palestinian state. These areas now have Israeli law, administration, and Jewish settlements all established. And don't even mention the Palestinian Authority as an actual Palestinian state. They only hold on to scattered Bantustan that hold little to no power against Israeli military raids or to even function as a state. So in short, PragerU's claims that Israel only wants to live in peace misses the point that the creation of Israel itself is the cause of the Arab-Israeli conflict and its developments till this day. It is a confronting reality for most people, but Zionism is an ideology that, regardless of any peace settlements, continues to drive the expansion of Israel at the expense of the Palestinian people, and will only continue in the coming future.
The problem, however, is that most Palestinians and many other Muslims and Arabs do not recognize the right of the Jewish state of Israel to exist. This has been true since 1947, when the United Nations voted to divide the land called Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews accepted the United Nations partition, but no Arab or any other Muslim country accepted it. When British rule ended on May 15, 1948, the armies of all the neighboring Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, and Egypt, attacked the one-day-old state of Israel in order to destroy it.
We have already talked about this, so I'm just going to play a clip from this debate, someone who's more educated than myself, and definitely PragerU, who responded to the same claim.
So the Palestinian Arab leadership rejected the partition, given the inequality in the proposed population exchange and the transfer of 1/3 of Palestine, including most of its best agricultural land, to recent immigrants. That's why. That's the part they're leaving out of the video. They're leaving it out.
So basically, PragerU misleads you again, but to repeat it over and over again, no matter what partition plan, no matter what the borders of Israel looked like, it would have always benefited the Jewish minority at the time, but it would have always been at the expense of the local Palestinian majority. Any scenario would have always included a large Muslim population threatened with being displaced from their homes, something which again continues in the present day. And to make PragerU's claims even more absurd, it was the Muslim world that allowed Jews to enjoy some of the best prosperity in their people's history. producing the most influential rabbis and intellectual movements across the medieval world. And for this reason, when Zionism was created in Europe during the 19th century, the movement was rarely popular among Jews in the Arab world. Because why would they care about a Jewish state when their Muslim neighbors treated them with tolerance and respect for some 1,000 years? This only changed when some 900,000 Jews in the Arab world were kicked out following the creation of Israel, and this tragic event is now exploited by many Zionists, such as PragerU, to suggest that the Muslim world had always hated Jews and that Israel must exist because these Jews are no longer accepted anywhere else. Look, to clarify, this event where Jews were expelled in the Arab world solely because Israel existed was the wrong thing to do and it should have never happened. But regardless, that will never justify Israel's oppression towards the Palestinian people because it doesn't change what's happening till this day.
Shortly after the war, the Arab states went to Khartoum, Sudan, and announced their famous 3 no's: no recognition, no peace, and no negotiations. What was Israel supposed to do?
PragerU even mentioning the 3 no's or any quote diplomatic warnings towards Israel doesn't matter. Because something that most Zionists don't really think about is most Muslim countries you can think of are either complicit or actually support the state of Israel. Because unfortunately, the countries that quote represent the Muslim world generally do nothing to effectively oppose Israel, and instead they try to act like they care about the Palestinians, but in reality, their word or anything they say don't mean anything. I'm going to give you an example. Erdogan, Turkey's president, for context, is one of the biggest voices you'll see against what Israel does to Palestinians. All of this is constantly promoted in the Turkish state media as if it's some hard-hitting attack towards Israel. But what you don't get told is that Erdogan thanked and handed out medals to the IDF just a couple months ago. Yeah, the same military that's responsible for raiding Al-Aqsa Mosque and is currently, as I'm speaking now, launching missiles towards Gaza and killing dozens of Palestinians, most of which are civilians, by the way. And look, I understand that what happened in Turkey with all the earthquakes was a horrific event and any help was needed. But if Erdogan really wanted to stick by his quote support for the Palestinians, why did he allow IDF soldiers to come to Turkey anyway? And why are even according to Israeli sources, why is Erdogan creating a quote new honeymoon between Israel and Turkey? And look, this doesn't apply for Erdogan, by the way. Let's talk about Jordan, the country that holds the most Palestinian refugees in the world. Well, they not only recognize Israel, but they also signed the infamous Abraham Accords alongside countries like Bahrain and UAE just 3 years ago. Saudi Arabia, the custodians of Islam's holiest sites, are actually open to normalizing ties with Israel. In short, it doesn't matter if there are Muslim countries that don't recognize Israel or even banning Israelis from entering their country, because when Palestinians need help the most, these same countries don't do anything to stop it. Diplomatic warnings don't do anything but prolong the suffering of the Muslims in Palestine, so while PragerU is right in suggesting that ordinary Muslims are against Israel, their idea that Muslim leaders even care about Israel is inaccurate and misleading. And from this point on, PragerU just continues to regurgitate the same claims for the duration of video. They claim that Israel wants Palestinians to recognize the Jewish state.
All the Palestinians have ever had to do is recognize Israel as a Jewish state and promise to live in peace with it.
I've debunked this over and over again, however, I have some extra points on the screen if you want to read it. They claim that Israel offered Palestinians the entire Western Bank in 2000. What a deal. But instead, the Palestinians launched terror attacks towards Jews.
But when Israel has proposed trading land for peace, as it did in 2000, when it agreed to give the Palestinians a sovereign state in more than 95% of the West Bank and all of Gaza, the Palestinian leadership rejected the offer and instead responded by sending waves of suicide terrorists into Israel.
This is one of PragerU's worst attempts to outright slander the Palestinians here, so I'm going to recommend you to all pause and read the context that PragerU misses out on screen here. And to finally cap off the video, PragerU then concludes saying this.
Please remember this. There has never been a state in the geographic area known as Palestine that was not Jewish. Israel is the third Jewish state to exist in that area. There was never an Arab state, never a Palestinian state, never a Muslim or any other state.
Originally, I was going to laugh at how PragerU used examples of Jewish states from over 2,000 years ago to justify Israel's existence, And I was also going to point out the centuries of Arab and Muslim rule in Palestine. However, everything that PragerU said reminded me of what I mentioned earlier in this video, that how nationalism in the past 200 years had made every ethnicity you can think of dream about having their own state, their own self-determination, their own history. And PragerU uses 2,000-year-old reminders of a Jewish presence in Palestine to justify the state of Israel, which is only about 70 years old at this point. It just shows how flawed nationalism is because, as I said before, it's not just Israel. Every modern day country that you can think of has some national myth or story that not only justifies its existence, but also unifies its people into supporting their country. If you trace back the founding myths and stories of your country, they generally rely on things like discovery, wars of independence, decolonization, and resistance against tyranny. They generally paint their countries as the underdogs against a foreign power, and this national struggle against all odds then led to their country coming into existence. On the outside, these stories are very pleasing to everyday people, and that is why stuff like patriotism even exists. And that is why people will do anything to justify their country and their nationalist beliefs till this day. But when you take a step back and look at the bigger picture of your country, you then realize that your country has done some absolutely messed up stuff in the name of said country. As what Ernest Renan's lecture, What is a Nation, pointed out, with every country holding a national story, they also forget whatever doesn't suit that story. Ethnic cleansings, massacres, persecution, and authoritarianism, just to name a few. That is why Israelis remember every single suicide bombing that happened in their country, but not the Palestinians that are beaten up by Israeli police or killed by rocket attacks. More importantly, they don't even think about what happened to the Palestinians so that their state of Israel could exist from 1948 onwards. Look, what I'm trying to get here is that every single country is built upon lies about their past, and I'm especially talking about the Muslim world here. The only reason why so-called Muslim countries even exist is because they needed something to replace Islam when the Caliphate was abolished 100 years ago. If we are not a Muslim Ummah, then what are we? Are we Saudis, Pakistanis, Syrians, Indonesians, Palestinians, Turks? These labels only divide us into tribalism, something that the Quran already warned us about in the 7th century. And to justify the tribes that we belong to, aka modern day countries, we have these romanticized retellings of our past and absolutely no memory of any wrongdoing committed by said country. So back to PragerU, their entire channel basically justifies the state of Israel by appealing to your emotions, by guilt-tripping the audience about the Holocaust, about the centuries of oppression towards the Jewish people. And all of this supposedly justifies Israel's oppression of another group of people. That's honestly what I want you to take away from this video. I'm not shitting on Israel to advocate for a Palestinian state, because there is nothing inherently Islamic about Palestine. I think that's something that many Muslims need to understand, but they don't, or any country for that matter. What should be achieved is unity in the Muslim world, regardless of your color of your skin or the language you speak, because we're not Palestinians, we're not Saudis, we're not Turks, we're not Pakistanis, we're not Indonesians, we're not Bangladeshis, we're Muslim. Full stop. So yeah, don't fall for PragerU's lies, but most importantly, don't let nationalism get in the way of being the best Muslim you can be, and being the best Muslim you can be in uniting the Muslim Ummah together. But for now, thank you for watching and take care.